Hi, my name is Leandro Facchinetti, and in this video I want to talk to you about this project of mine. It is a library for JavaScript that allows you to write HTML as text template literals. And in this video I'm going to cover what the library even is, how to use it, how to install, and how to work with the library in your projects. I'm also going to give you some ideas of how this library can be combined with a bigger architecture for different kinds of applications. But more importantly, on the third part of this video, I am going to talk to you about the statement that this library is making, the philosophy behind why I wanted to have a library like this. It's a very simple library, but the concept behind it, I think, is mature and strong, and it's a bold statement to make these days in the current state of development for JavaScript and related technologies. So let's jump right into this, and I'm going to start by showing you how to install the library and work with it. It's called liafac HTML, and I'm going to use here in this demonstration for development, I'm going to use TypeScript, and I'm also going to use CS Node, so I'm able to run TypeScript files as if they were just JavaScript files. I can just call them from the command line as usual. So the package is already installed, and I'm going to create a file here for demonstration, index.ts. And the way you import this library, there is a default import, so you can do just this, and that works. But in case you need a type related to your HTML, there is also this type. So this is a function that is a tagged template literal, and this is a type. So you can do things like header has a type of HTML, for instance, and then your header is something like this. Okay, so that's pretty simple stuff. Let's just console log this to the console, and we can see what the header is. So npx ts node index.ts. As you can see, it printed a string to the console, and that's what this is. HTML here is represented as a string. You couldn't get any simpler. In fact, this is a library that helps concatenate strings to build a string of HTML. Yeah, it is a very simple library. The implementation is also super simple, and in a separate video, I'm going to do a code review of how I implemented this. There is nothing surprising in there. So why am I making a video about this? Well, because there are all sorts of fun things that you can do with this, and I think it's a powerful way of building web applications. First, let's get into what else you need to install, because you may have noticed that here I have syntax highlighting for HTML, and that is true of arbitrarily complex HTML that you write here. And that's because there is this extension for Visual Studio Code. It is ES6 string HTML. So what it does is very simple. It detects that there is this HTML tag on your template literal, and then invokes the syntax highlighter for HTML in the HTML string. Pretty simple stuff, but if you're using this library, then you really need this, because you wouldn't want to write HTML without this help, right? I mean, it would look like a string all the way, which is inconvenient. So there is that, and if you are using things like Prettier, and I use Prettier in all my projects, so I have here the Visual Studio Code extension to work with Prettier, and I also install Prettier on my project, so I would do something like npm install for development, Prettier, and in my package JSON, I would probably have a script for testing, probably. And in that script, I would call Prettier check on, in this case, just my index.ts file. And I suppose that if I do just that, then I run the tests. Yes, everything is using the Prettier style. And why am I mentioning this? Well, because Prettier has support for HTML in JavaScript like this. So for instance, if maybe I forget to close the tag and I run Prettier, it formatted in the way that Prettier wants to format, which is to put everything in one line and put these spaces here. So it takes care of spaces very well, but it also put the closing tag because that's the convention that Prettier follows. I prefer it like this. And when I run Prettier again, this is accepted. If you have some spaces, then Prettier normalizes the number of spaces. But if you have no spaces, Prettier respects that because space may be significant in HTML. Anyway, I can run Prettier again and it will check and it will be fine. So there is very good support for this strategy of having tagged template literals for representing HTML. It is supported by this Visual Studio Code extension for syntax highlighting. It is supported by Prettier, and it is supported in GitHub. When you are reviewing code on GitHub, this will show up with the right syntax highlighting. And besides syntax highlighting, there isn't much that you need really to work with HTML because it's a quite simple language. There are other extensions for Visual Studio Code if you look for them. They are similar to this one, and they also have the ability to use IntelliSense in these strings. So you could do things like S and then autocomplete, and it would autocomplete with span, for instance, or it would suggest span. But I don't have those extensions installed because they break other parts and they don't play well with some of my other extensions. I found that this one that will be linked below, it wasn't developed by me. I only developed this library. But yeah, this extension works well with all my other extensions. Okay, so that is how you can do simple HTML in JavaScript, and it takes care of the hard parts of doing this templating with HTML. For instance, suppose that you need to interpolate the name here. So you have some other variable for the name. Okay, so that still works the same. It's going to print my name to the console. But suppose that this was provided by the user and that this contains some script tags because they are malicious and they're trying to run something that looks like code. I don't even know how to write font. Okay, a hack. Okay, so the library is going to do the right thing and escape strings, and it doesn't try to escape strings by itself. It uses this other library called AgeE for HTML entities that does encoding the right way. It takes in account all the edge cases that could come up. And then my library is doing the right thing and calling that. And even if there are things that are not even valid characters for HTML, and there are some characters that are invalid, like a backspace. In JavaScript, it's represented with the \b. And if you have something like that, I'm going to put pipes around the thing so you can look at the result. But you can see that the library is doing the right thing and it's taking out that character. So if you're using this library, you can be sure that everything will be escaped, that all the characters will be valid, and that you will end up with a valid HTML string. Also, if you have, for some reason, you have some HTML that you trust because you built it yourself, so it's not the case that this is a name, but it's a sub. So this is a header, so maybe this is header part. And then suppose that you even built this using the HTML tagged template literal. So you would do something like maybe span and then my name. Then if you just do this like we were doing before, of course, it's going to escape the part and the HTML part, the header part will be broken. Well, if you use $2, then my library does not escape the string. It treats that as a safe string. Then you already sanitized in some other way, and it keeps the HTML tags. Of course, there is no real magic going on here. My library is just looking at this string and detecting that it ends with a $sign. So there is this double $sign thing is not a JavaScript thing, not really. It is just a fancy or a slightly clever way of doing this. It wasn't my idea. I copied from some other library that does a similar thing, though not 100% exactly the same. Anyway, double $sign gets you out of the escapes if you need that. Also, if you have a list, then suppose that you have not header part, but header parts, then you have a list. And in this case, it's not going to be HTML. It's just going to be a list of names. So something like this. And I'm going to put a space here. So maybe a space is another element on the list. So yeah, now this is not the header parts, but the name parts. And if you just interpolate it like that, then my library knows that a list should be concatenated. And you end up with this. And of course, if you have a list of name parts that include HTML, so maybe if you have something like span, like this, and similarly for the last name, and now since these elements are HTML, I'm going to mark this as HTML as well, though it doesn't really make any difference. It's going to be a space, a string containing a space. Anyway, so if you have something like this, then when I run it, it will escape all the elements in the list. But now that we know that these are safe strings, we can use the double $sign and it won't escape the strings. So you end up with this. And yeah, the space there was missing. But we can run this again and the space will be there. Okay. So that is the extent of the features in the library. That is all the library is doing. It's concatenating strings to form HTML strings. It is sanitizing the strings that are interpolated. And it is concatenating lists if you have lists interpolated this way. And it's also sanitizing using external libraries that do the right thing. I'm not coming up with a bespoke way of sanitizing HTML strings, as many other libraries that have this sort of idea. Other libraries in this space, they have their own bespoke way of encoding HTML strings. So here in the documentation for this library, the link will be below in the description. You can see all these examples and some more, and you can see a comparison with other libraries in the same space. There is nothing quite like the library that I'm showing you, otherwise I wouldn't have built it. But yeah, there are similar libraries in this space. There will also be links below to the Visual Studio Code extensions I mentioned, like this one and the Prettier one, and also a link to the Prettier project in case you are new to that. And now let's think about what you can do with this tagged template leaders, how you can organize your code or your project, your application to use this. Now, if you're familiar with things like JSX for React, then it is in a similar space, and it is not like things like handlebars that you may also know. So I'm going to talk about how to use this library in the context of a bigger project. Keep in mind that it's similar to what you would do with JSX. It's not quite similar to what you would do with handlebars. But let's talk about how you can use this to, first of all, do things like partials, templates, and helpers. These things that you would need for a templating library. Well, you have strings in JavaScript. That's what this is doing, right? It's just strings in JavaScript. There is no magic here. So if you want to have something like a partial, then it can be a function. So for instance, well, you can kind of think of the name parts as a partial as well. And if your partial has no arguments, then your partial could be just literally a variable. And yeah, it is kind of at the same time trivial that I'm saying, yeah, you can extract this into a variable. But at the same time, it's super powerful that you can do this, because now you can leverage JavaScript, which is a big language with many features. You can leverage JavaScript when doing your templating. It also has some downsides to using such a big language for doing templates, because you have too much power. But if you are careful about the power that you use and when you use it, I think that you are better off than trying to come up with some other templating library like Handlebars, which is a different language and it has its own conventions. So for instance, the way you interpolate variables is different, and you have to learn all the ways that Handlebars wants you to do things. Anyway, this is JavaScript. So how do we do something like a partial? Well, it's just a function. So maybe I have a header, maybe a partial that appears in some bigger context. So I'll do a header partial, and I'll call this a header partial, but you may as well just call this a header. You know what? I'm going to call it a header. So the header, it receives a name as a string and returns HTML. As I said, this HTML type, if you are in TypeScript, if you're not in TypeScript, then you can just use the default import from this library, which is the HTML tag. But if you are in TypeScript, then this is just a way for you to mark that the string represents HTML. It's really a string at the end of the day. Anyway, this function takes a name as an argument, returns some HTML, and the HTML that it returns is this. And it's using the name, but the name is not safe. It may come from the user, so no $$ there. And then how do you use that? Well, I'll do a console log, and at this point you can pretty much tell what's going on here. So I'm just going to use this. Maybe, you know what, here is a good trick. If you are in Visual Studio Code, you can change the mode of the file from TypeScript to HTML, and then you can use HTML real quick. I mean, the extension that I'm using for Visual Studio Code doesn't give me IntelliSense and autocomplete, but I can just change the mode of the file real quick, and then I have IntelliSense. And I can do this, and then I can include my header, and then maybe in the body or in the main I'll have something else, and then I can switch back to TypeScript mode, and this needs the tag. Okay, so that is better. And the doc type needs to, I think that the doc type needs to be the first thing. You cannot have any spaces before the doc type. I'm not sure about this, but I think that's the case. And I can call prettier to format all this. So again, this is just JavaScript. So if you don't want to have this in line, if you want to have that space there, you can just call trim, right? It's just a string. So that's another way of writing this, and I think I prefer the formatting this way. One thing that this library that I'm showing you does not do is format the HTML, okay? So it's going to output this exactly as written here. Well, after having trimmed, of course, but exactly as written here. It doesn't try to dedent, it doesn't try to remove this indentation, it doesn't try to call prettier to format, it doesn't do any of that. If you want, you can always call prettier yourself. So you could call prettier over here. I don't need that, so I won't do it. So now I'm going to call it again just so you see the output, but yeah, it's nothing surprising. And oh, that's interesting. What's going on here? Oh, yeah, so I forgot to call the function, and I forgot to give it a name. Okay, that's better. Let's give this a try. And yeah, okay, so this is my name as part of the header and then something else. So that's how you can do a partial. What if you want to do not a partial but a template? So instead of just calling your partial from within the bigger template, you want to have a template in which you can pass some kind of argument. So let's do a layout, for instance. That's going to be our template. And this is going to be the content of the main. So this main is going to be some HTML, and we are going to output HTML as well. So it's pretty much going to be this. So I'm going to call it like that. And then in the main, we don't pass something else like this, but instead we trust this. So we just interpolate unsafely, and that's our layout. So now we have a layout with maybe a paragraph with my name. Nothing too surprising there. So partials, templates, they look pretty much the same. They are just functions in JavaScript. And helpers, I don't even think I need to talk to you about helpers. Helpers are things like things that would format a date or that would capitalize a string. So maybe let's look at a helper that would take this name, for instance, here, and a helper that would put everything to uppercase. And now on the header, my name is going to be shouting instead of just written. It's shouting my name. Helpers are just functions or method calls in this case, I suppose. And I wasn't even expecting to use the to locale uppercase. I was just expecting to use to uppercase. I think that's simpler. Anyway, the point here being, all of these concepts that would be special concepts in other templating libraries, or that would be special concepts in things like JSX, they would, in React, they would be props, and you would have to learn about how they are different from regular arguments. In handlebars, they would have special syntax for things like this. In JavaScript, it is just a function. It takes arguments, it returns something, it does interpolation, it does method calls. You already know JavaScript, you already know this templating language. Similarly for things like iterating over a list. So let's say that you have a footer and you have a list. Now I don't have a list here laying around, so just create an array with 10 elements, take the keys, and then I have an array of 0 to 9, and I'll map. So I'll map my index, and I'll produce some HTML that is maybe a list item. So suppose I have a list here in the footer for whatever reason, and my list items interpolate my index like that. And then when I run that, because, hang on, what's going on there? Oops, I need to configure TypeScript to produce a newer version of JavaScript as an output. So I'm going to call tsc init real quick and change the tsconfig to produce something like ES 2019. Now I should have access to that keys function. And then I have a list with the numbers. So iterating over a list has no special syntax associated with it. It's just iterating over a list. And similarly, if you wanted to render something conditionally, so suppose that here in the header, I only want to uppercase if the name starts with the letter L. So I could do something like name starts with the letter L, then you uppercase, otherwise you to lowercase. And if you just want to avoid rendering, so it is uppercase because my name starts with the letter L, but in some cases you want to just do some conditional rendering. In some cases you don't want to print anything. So if you don't want to print if the name starts with the letter L, that's how you do this. Oh, I'm not doing the unconditional interpolation, so I should, as a good measure, not say that this is HTML. So it should be like this. And now my name will not be rendered here in the header. Still rendering the main because it's here part of our main that is part of our call to the layout, but it's not rendered in the header anymore. Conditional rendering, no special syntax, it is just JavaScript. Now, the next thing is, some of you may like this idea of having HTML in your JavaScript. I kind of like this, I prefer it this way. I think it makes sense to separate my concerns instead of my technologies. So I don't think I am very productive by separating CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. I prefer to separate logging, authentication, and creating a new post. These sort of stories, I think, are better separation than technologies. But depending on your project, you may be working with a designer who is only touching HTML, and a database administrator who is only in charge of writing SQL. So it makes more sense to separate by technology. And if you want to do that, then again, it's just JavaScript, no surprises. So your layout could be in a separate file, and you would take this function and you would export default that function. And of course, you would need to import the library as well. And here my header is not available, so I guess I could extract this into its own file, but I'm not. I'm just going to paste it down here. So now I have everything that this file needs, and then in my index, I can import the layout from layout, and then, oh yeah, it's complaining because there is already a layout defined here. But if I just remove it, then this is all happy. And if I run this again, no surprises there. So if you want to separate your script, your templates into files, and maybe even the helpers or your partials, they could be their own files as well, then use the module system. It's just JavaScript. You can use this library in Node.js. If you are doing server-side rendering, it's perfect for that. In fact, that's my preferred strategy for rendering. I prefer to just render everything to a string and then serve. And in Express, I could say something like, suppose I had Express here. I have not installed it, so I guess I can install it real quick. So if I have Express installed, and I have an Express server, so I need to import Express from Express, and I need an app, and when I get / then I can just send my, well, exactly what I have here. Instead of console log, I say this, and that's my response. And then I can app listen on port 4000, for instance. And now I can ts node my index file, wait for everything to load. I have no indication that everything has loaded, but I suppose it has. So I can go to this, and yeah. So, I think I am not interpolating the header right, because the header has some HTML, and I'm not unsafely interpolating it. So now I saved, and I'm going to restart the server, go to the browser again. Okay, so I really like this strategy of having my HTML right in there in my Express server, no rendering to JSON, and then having a different client-side application that consumes the JSON and renders everything on the client side. I prefer to do everything in Express like this. Also, in Node.js, if you are doing static websites, then what you have to do is just import fs from file system promises, because why not? Well, in this case, I don't really care, so I'll do just that. So you would do something like write file sync, and then your layout. And here you may be doing something like you call out to a Markdown parser, so you would write some files in Markdown. That's perfectly fine. And then you also have to say where you're writing this to, right? So your index HTML would be that. I have an extra closing parentheses right there. So now this is no longer an Express server. I can comment out everything that has to do with Express, because now this is a static website generator. So when I run this, I get an HTML file out, and I can put this HTML file somewhere to be served statically. So that's a very simple static website generator, but it is a static website generator, and it's a simple one written in Node.js with inline templates like this. Super powerful. It's a super powerful language, JavaScript, so you can just do that. But let's say that doing everything on the server, either by static websites or Express websites like the one that I showed you here with server-side rendering. Suppose that you do have an API in JSON that you need to consume, and you need to work on the client side to render your templates. Then you can also use this library on the browser, and you can do exactly what we are doing here, except that you would probably do something like document.insert, not before, insert a JSON HTML, and then you would say something like before begin. I think I'm getting this right. And then you could do your HTML in line like this. There is no virtual DOM in place here. There is no extra steps in terms of understanding what's going on. It's just strings that are turned into HTML, and the browser already has all these APIs to work with text as strings that are turned into HTML when you pass them to certain functions. So the browser already has all the technology you would need, and you can keep the state in the DOM, and you don't need libraries like React. They are still great when you need high fidelity, you need complex interactions, you need to hold a lot of state. But if you just have some simple thing that you are doing for this small part of your app, then this is perfectly fine. You don't need the extra complexity. You don't need the preprocessors. You don't need JSX. It's just JavaScript. And I guess that is the big statement that I am making with this library. It's a small library. It's a big statement. You should do things like server-side rendering first because they're simpler. They are also faster, and you can do a lot more in less time. There is less things, moving parts to understand and to communicate to other people who are developing in your project. And even more importantly, arguably, there is no extra language to learn. There is no JSX with, it is very similar to the thing I'm showing you, right? It's just HTML in JavaScript, but it has its own peculiar ways of doing some things. You don't have to learn JSX if you don't want to. It's just JavaScript with strings. Also, you don't have to learn a whole new language. It's not a complex language. You can kind of learn it by just reading this tutorial, but it is its own special syntax for doing things like loops. So if you want to do partials, if you want to do loops, it is its own little language that you have to learn. Well, no. If you're using this library I'm showing you, a tagged template literal is just JavaScript. So I really like tagged template literals. I think that they are one of the most powerful features in JavaScript because it allows you to connect to other languages without some intermediary. There is no bridge between what you write in JavaScript and these other concepts like HTML in this case, but it also translates to other things like CSS and SQL. As I'm going to show you in my future videos, I have libraries for working with CSS and SQLite in Node.js using tagged template literals. And so the tagged template literal is bridging to all these other languages in a way that is still just JavaScript. You know the syntax, you know how interpolation works, but everything else that comes along with the other language you get for free. So syntax highlighting and the semantics of this other language, people already know the familiarity, the tools that exist to work with these other languages. Things like post CSS to work with CSS, they just work because it's just strings in the end of the day. Anyway, that's what I wanted to cover in this video. That's my small library for working with HTML. It's just tagged template literals. In the future video, I'm going to do a code review, but you kind of already expect that there isn't much there. I mean, the encoding of the interpolated strings is done with another library that I'm just calling out to. So it boils down to just concatenating strings. There isn't much there. And you can still leverage this to write super powerful code on the server and, if you have to, on the browser as well. But the big statement behind this simple library is that you can keep things simple. You can avoid complexity until complexity is necessary. And you can still leverage other people's knowledge of HTML and of JavaScript. You don't have to teach them an extra language like JSX or handlebars or what have you. And it just works. It's simple. This simplicity is something that has been lost in this recent years of web development. Some people were trying to get it back. There are projects that are on this direction, and I very much like them. Anyway, there are some other things to talk about, like CSS and SQLite, so keep watching these videos. Make sure you subscribe to the channel to get notifications when these new videos come out. I have a whole umbrella of projects in this space of trying to keep things simple using tagged template literals. And also make sure you support my work on Patreon, on PayPal. Thanks for watching. I see you on the next one. Bye.